Hello again, and welcome to week 2 of Intro to American Studies. I hope your first week of classes went all right, and I hope that you're able to find some time this Labor Day weekend to relax with your friends and family. So this week we are reading the introduction to Matthew Fry Jacobson's Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race. And this is a book that's been highly regarded within the field of American studies, as well as within the field of whiteness studies, which is the interdisciplinary study of whiteness. So why did I choose this book? Well, in my opinion, the best books are often those that put something into words that I've been thinking or feeling but couldn't really articulate. And Jacobson's book really did this with regard to my own racial experience. So, people ask me all the time, are Jewish people white? Because they know that I study this. And, in the past, I would answer kind of like, well, yes and no. Because, if I'm interacting with the cops, then yeah, they treat me like I'm white. But if I'm interacting with a white nationalist, well, no, they definitely don't think of Jews as white. And so Jacobson helped me to make sense of this sort of seeming contradiction, right? Because he shows how that question itself, right, are Jews white, is a problem because it frames this as a yes or no kind of question, and that race isn't that simple, right? He shows how race is a social construction, meaning that it only exists in the ways that we define it as a society. There's no gene for race, there's no test that can objectively determine your race. And so how can I be white in a cop car but not at a Klan rally? Well, because whiteness is an idea, and different people will have different ideas about my whiteness in different contexts. And furthermore, Jacobson talks about how people's ideas about whiteness changed over time. So my ancestors would have experienced their own whiteness very differently than I do in the 21st century. In particular, he tells basically a three-part story. So first, he talks about the first naturalization laws in this country in 1790 and how they defined citizenship as something for free white persons. So right off the bat, right, citizenship is racialized as white, and therefore my ancestors and the ancestors of every other European descendant person benefited from their whiteness because it allowed them to become citizens, right? So in this era, the ideal American is, right, a free white person, meaning pretty much anyone from Europe. Then, fast forward about 100 years to the late 19th century, right, and immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe has become so massive that many Americans are freaking out about how all these immigrants are allegedly threatening American jobs and culture, which probably sounds like a familiar story. So in this era, Jacobson describes the fracturing of whiteness. So Jews and Italians and others are seen as inferior white races. And people now are concerned not just about whiteness understood as Europeanness, but about the relationship between race and language and religion. So by white, do we mean English speaking? By white, do we mean Christian? Or even specifically Protestant, because there was a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice. And during this period, there was serious violence against many of these groups, including lynchings of Italian Americans and Jewish Americans, though nothing close to the number of Black Americans who were lynched then and continue to be lynched now. And this anti-immigrant racism ultimately by the 1920s leads to a dramatic restriction in the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe that are allowed in the country, period. And so by the 1920s, right, the ideal American is not only white, meaning from Europe, but also meaning Protestant, English-speaking, and specifically from Northern and Western Europe. And then, lastly, part 3, right, of Jacobson's story is after World War II, when we have this victory over the German Nazis, which makes explicit racism, particularly against Jews, very unpopular. And there's this kind of boosterish idea that like all Americans came together to fight this war against the evil racist Nazis. And so the idea of the ideal American kind of expands now again back to kind of all those who are European, right? or of European descent. And simultaneously, right, the civil rights movement is successfully calling out anti-blackness and calling attention, right, to this black-white divide and the ways in which even, right, white immigrants who have been discriminated against, right, are not experiencing, right, the sort of racism, right, that black Americans have experienced. And so in this era, right, Jacobson says that whiteness is being reconsolidated, and all of those inferior white races from the 1920s, by the 1960s, are more or less benefiting from the same access to education and jobs and housing, right, that all white people are. And they're also being called out for the ways in which they participate in anti-blackness. And so here is where you start to get this common defensive response of, I'm not white, I'm Italian. I'm not white, I'm Jewish, right? Because if I'm not white, then I'm not responsible for addressing anti-blackness, right? And so this argument has been used very effectively since around the 1970s to argue against affirmative action, against reparations, and I'm sure it's being used now to oppose the current demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in fact, check out the discussion board for this week, where I'll post an example of what I'm asking you to do with the discussion board, and it relates to this idea. So that's why I love this book. It helped me to understand my own racial experience. It's helped me to understand how central race has been to U.S. citizenship and immigration policy. And it's helped me to understand how different groups of white people position themselves vis-a-vis each other and vis-a-vis movements for black liberation. So I hope you got something out of it too. And make sure to submit your brief reflection on Blackboard and your discussion board post both by midnight next Sunday, the 13th. And I'll see you next week.